Good morning, and thank you for joining INSA for Coffee and Conversation with Charlie Allen. I am pleased to introduce IC Trailblazer, former William Oliver Baker Award recipient, and one of the subjects of In Deep, the new book by Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Rode. Please welcome the Honorable Joan Dempsey.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of INSA, thank you for joining us for a conversation with an IC legend and a man I'm proud to call my friend, the Honorable Charlie Allen. I do not use the word legend lightly. For more than 6 decades, Charlie has brought his substantial expertise and insights to some of our nation's most pressing challenges, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the return of the Great Forces competition. And his work ethic is legendary. I have heard it said repeatedly, if you don't think you're getting your money's worth out of the federal government, you have not met Charlie Allen. Now, I know we have a lot of ground to cover this morning, and before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. We want to make this platform as interactive as possible, so please use the questions box on the right side of your screen to submit questions for Charlie, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. We also welcome members of the press to the call today, and that's a reminder that this program is on the record. And finally, I would like to thank our sponsor, Microsoft, for its critical support of this program. INSA could not bring you this kind of premier programming without the support of our industry partners. So I am pleased to welcome Joe Schmenk, Program Director for Microsoft Azure Government Cloud, an interesting job to have right now, who will introduce our speaker. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Joan. Microsoft is proud to sponsor this program and to support INSA as they continue to keep us connected and engaged on top issues and mission priorities. Today is no exception. Although I have to say, it's a little daunting to introduce somebody as accomplished as our guest, Charlie, this morning. It's no exaggeration to say Charlie Allen has dedicated his life to the security of our nation. Charlie's storied 51-year career in the intelligence community includes 47 years with the CIA, where he first got his start in 1958. Over the years, he held numerous critical roles before serving as the agency's first and only Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Collection from 1998 until 2005. He would go on to serve as the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis and Chief Intelligence Officer at the Department of Homeland Security before moving off to the private sector. His career spans some of the most consequential moments in our nation's history, some of which he will discuss this morning. Charlie embodies all that is good about the community. There's nobody more dedicated, patriotic, and mission-driven. And it's a personal honor, Charlie, to introduce you this morning. Big welcome, and we're looking forward to the session. Back to you, Joan.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks again to Microsoft for your support. Now, to kick things off, Charlie, we're not here today just to praise Caesar. I first met Charlie about 30 years ago in the late 1980s when I was a special assistant to the deputy director at DIA, and Charlie was in the National Intelligence Officer position for strategic warning. And I remember my boss complaining bitterly because Charlie Allen was coming in to meet with him to complain because DIA wasn't supporting the NIO for strategic warning in the way Charlie thought he should. And indeed, Charlie did come in to complain. And as usual, Charlie was right. We weren't doing what we should have been doing. And that's something that really has described Charlie throughout his long career of service. He calls leaders to make sure that they do what they should do for the good of the nation. And that is a consistent theme. It's not always a welcome message that he delivers, but I was thinking back, Charlie, to that time 30 years ago and to how intelligence worked around the 1990 timeframe. And I would argue that what we did then looks an awful lot like what we do today. We get more information faster today, but I'm not sure that that necessarily equates to better intelligence. Our processes are still pretty linear. Our disciplines are fairly separate. We have tens of thousands more people doing intelligence today because in 1990, we didn't have many contractors involved, and we're spending billions of dollars every year doing it. So I think one could make an argument that the quality of intelligence is not that much greater than it was 30 years ago. What's your take on that perspective?
Well, I think we're a lot better in certain ways, but there's still a lot of linear way of doing things. We still have the separate agencies. Jim Clapper spent a lot of time talking about integration of the community with data sharing efforts that were, I think, immense. But we still are not to where we need to be. We really are not really aligned with the future threat. Our budget's not aligned with the future threat. We're still working very hard on COIN, that's counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. We have not aligned the budget to the future. And from that point of view, we, DNI Radcliffe and the new leadership, Neil Wiley, the principal executive, have a lot of responsibility to start shifting the entire intelligence community with them to do what needs to be required to meet the needs of 2030. We are not there. And yet we look back at 30 years ago, and yeah, there's a lot of familiar ways, a lot of familiar processes. We've updated them. We have new clothes and new ways of talking, but some of it is still regretfully the past. And we can't do that with the rise of great power competition the way it is today.
So let me follow up on that, because in my experience, we've only been able to make dramatic change in the community, either as a result of real or perceived failures or through dramatic funding reductions. And I don't think anybody wants to see either of those events. So how can the new DNI actually make progress and make change? How do we do that absent some cataclysmic event?
It is very difficult for the DNI to make change. He can change only a couple of billion a year out of a budget of umpteen billion, as you know. And with his current powers, there's a limitation to it. Bob Gates didn't take the DNI job when it was offered to him because he felt it would not have the power. It's been demonstrated again and again. But there's got to be a whole new approach and leadership to the community, and the gap between ability to perform and to achieve is still very, very definitively great. We are behind in technical collection and technical analysis. We're collecting petabytes of data, yet we don't have the AI, the artificial intelligence, the machine learning to make sense out of all. As Andrew Hallman used to say, what does all this stuff mean? We have it, but can we track it? I don't know how you get but leadership. You know, it involves character, it involves competence, it involves accountability, it involves a bit of humility to be a good DNI. So, from my perspective, that you've got to empower. He has to empower the heads of the agencies, but they have to agree to that we have to change quickly. And he's got to establish, in particular, John, a very close relationship with Secretary of Defense, because the changes will not come unless you have the SecDef's support and endorsement in every respect. It just won't happen. And if I were DNI Radcliffe, I would go down the river and into the five-sided building very often and meet with the SecDef as often as I could to get him very much focused on the future. We're still doing things for the COCOMs, the combatant commanders, versus planning for the threats of the future.
Yeah, Charlie, so I want to follow up on that. But first, this is a technical note, and the voice of God that was embodied in Tish Long just sent me a message and said, we can't see you. Can you accept your invitation to join the webcam? And while you do that, I'm going to follow up on that question because, you know, we have a long history in the IC. There you are, Charlie. Great to see you. We have a long history in the IC of when we don't have good intelligence, we make assumptions about the threats and what they can do as opposed to what their intent is. So let me use an example to tease this out a little bit. The US protects our sea lines of communication, and yet when we see China doing that, we view it as aggression. Is China being aggressive in their operations in the South China Sea and their extension into out-of-area operations, or are they protecting their own sea lines of communication? And how do we think about that China as it becomes a more strategic and global economic power. What's your take on it?
Well, I think we have to go back to Davos in 2017, where Xi Jinping laid out his future, and the future of China very clearly. His job is to dominate, and he made it very clear when he didn't necessarily speak to the United States, but his goal is to dominate the United States politically, militarily, economically in particular, and diplomatically. And he's well on his way to doing that. And we have not responded. For years, we did not respond to the South China Sea and the first chain of island efforts of Xi Jinping. And we're now doing that to some degree. But the real answer is going to be in technology. Can we deal with Chinese technology? 5G is moving at great speed. Even Huawei, with all of its flaws, we don't have a 5G capability end to end. We don't have AI/ML. We're not putting the resources in. So it's a real threat. China is a real threat, and we've got to recognize that. And we've got to now do the investment required where we are 10 years from now. It is not going to attack us militarily. I can't speak to Taiwan, and it's gradually tightening the grip over Hong Kong. It's not the same situation we had. I don't agree necessarily with everything Robert O'Brien said, but we did sleep for a good deal of time to begin this, and we're not there. We're not postured to get there.
So Charlie, listening to you reminds me that you were really the bedrock of strategic warning for our country in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And one of our challenges today is that we don't really have a systemic, or for that matter, a systematic approach to strategic warning. We've kludged together national intelligence estimates and the President's Daily Book to warn episodically, but we have no real strategic warning system, in my opinion. Now, personally, I believe that strategic warning is the responsibility of the entire interagency, not just the IC, but we don't seem to be doing it anywhere today. Is that a fair criticism? And what's your take on how should we be thinking about strategic warning?
We don't have a framework. Bob Gates put one in 1992, but he left government shortly after putting it in, never implemented. The NIO for warning was abolished in 2009 or something like that. Ken Knight was the last one. We don't have anyone that is in charge. We don't teach it in the Sherman Kent School. We barely teach it in the National Intelligence University, NIU, and Dr. Gordon teaches it. We don't know what strategic warning is, and yet we continue to get criticism. We got criticism of President Obama, the contagion. He didn't feel like he was warned that there would be a contagion. We're focused on Tunisia and what internally, and not what was happening broadly across the Middle East in the Arab Spring. We saw John Brennan spoke of the sudden rise of ISIS. Well, we could see ISIS developing, the early formation. We didn't do that. And I can cite many other examples, and I could go on forever. After all, I was a guy in 1973 that put to bed the PDV that said, well, things are, Syria and Egypt are exercising more realistically, but they have no intention of attacking Israel. The Israelis, of course, agreed with that. God help us. The next morning, we had the disaster of disasters on our life. And I was very seared by that because I was a production manager for military analysis at the time. And I warned in 1990, in July and August, that Saddam would take down all of Kuwait. And yet we made the same mistake. I was the Cassandra at the time. Cassandra always was forecast the disasters, but no one ever believed her. So I was called the Cassandra, and I still am called that to some degree.
Yeah, we don't expect a perfect track record. The fact that you raise these issues, I think, is certainly more than what most people have done. And your record of getting it right is pretty amazing, Charlie. I do think if only we knew someone on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board who might be willing to take this issue of strategic warning on. Who could that be? But let me go on to my next question, because I think it's also an important issue that we want to get on the record today. By every account, I've heard that the intelligence community has done superb work on Russian interference or attempts at interference in US elections. Yet there has not been a lot of, at least open reaction in the US government to Russian interference in our domestic politics. Now, during the Cold War, such interference might have been remedied in the Fulda Gap. So what do you say today to young intelligence officers or people interested in a career in intelligence about the relevance and importance of intelligence today as compared to our past?
It is cutting edge, and it is crucial. It is the future. I will say this, and I quote Joe Nye to some degree. When Putin looks at the world, he sees himself surrounded. He sees a need to restore the greatness of what was once the Soviet Union, and he's doing it. He did it in Crimea. He did it in Donbass. And he did it he moved into Syria. He's now moved into Libya, where he has fighter bombers, probably, I assume, with Russian pilots flying on the behalf of General Haftar. And the disinformation program that he epitomized is very much active today in the 2018 elections. That means that DHS, who sort of has the imprimatur to deal with influence or interference with the elections of 2018, it's really up to more than DHS, and the IC recognized that. Bill Evanina has that. He's been tapped, I guess, by the acting DNI to provide the briefing or briefings to the two parties as they compete as we go down to the November election. It's a big responsibility. Let me say, Joe Nye said, a declining power is a dangerous power, and I believe Joe Nye on this. I worked for Joe Nye for 18 months.
Charlie, you've answered my next question, and that was going to be, is a career in intelligence as relevant today as it was in the past? And I think you've given us great examples of how relevant it is today, and that this is a career that people can make an impact really at every level of their progression through the intelligence community. I want to ask you, and you've touched on a couple of these, but what moments in your career, your long and storied career, I like to tell people that you started your career in intelligence the year I was born. That's not quite true, and I know you hate to hear me say that, but it's almost true. It's pretty close. So what are the moments that stand out in your memory, either personal or institutional, that reflect intelligence's impact over your long and storied career?
The events, the big events in my career, of course, has been working for you as assistant director for collection and really changing the way we did collection, the way we integrated collection, the way we brought not only the analysts in to set the priorities and the needs, but to bring all the community together on hard targets. I set up a collection concept development center, which no longer exists, which only took on the hard targets and the hardest problems, because that was your direction at the time. You will not do any frivolous collection efforts. You will work only on the hard, most dangerous, and most challenging problems. That's, to me, was the epitome. 7 years working under you, part of that time, and your successor. It was a really, Larry Kinswater, it was really a good time to be in government and to solve the problems and to particularly see some brilliant breakthroughs in collection, where we still have great capabilities today, as you know.
Yeah, it was an interesting time for the community, and it was a very challenging time for the nation. I know that it would be hard for you to talk about maybe the personal or institutional successes that you've had. You just mentioned a few of them as the assistant DCI for collection, but what moments really stand out in your memory? You also mentioned an earlier perceived or real failure, an imperfection, I would prefer to say, what other issues really stand out for you as being significant intelligence issues for the country, good, bad, or indifferent?
Well, our failure in 1962, we wrote a national estimate saying that the Soviet Union would not introduce offensive nuclear weapons outside the Warsaw Pact. What a terrible assumption, what a terrible mistake that was. It led to the abolishment of Sherman Kent's Office of National Estimate. To be part of the team that started planning the new government in Cuba, once we put the 82nd in and the Marines and took over Cuba, that was it. We all went to work every day as the tensions ticked upwards, and Major Anderson was shot down as flying over Cuba in his U-2 and was killed. That stands out pretty bravely. I told my wife goodbye. She was going to North Carolina. I gave her a letter where we could meet after the nuclear war had ended, and that still stands out as a special time. We had a B-52 with nuclear bombs at Dulles Airport, which hadn't opened at the time. That's when I saw us at our best. When I saw CIA at its best, and the people at CIA, just absolutely magnificent. We did great work. We did great work in providing the support in taking down Al Qaeda in the 2001, 2002, pressing the leadership of the community who didn't think we needed it to take the Air Force Predator and start using it, and then to arm the Predator. I pushed for that so it could go off the rails and could deliver a lethal punch under appropriate authorities. We did that, and George Tenet became a great believer and a great acolyte, great advocate for this, for a way to take down the inner circle around Osama bin Laden. Those were some really good moments, and moments of real triumph where we did that. Now we've got this new challenge, which I think is even graver, given the circumstances and condition of the United States and its ability to put and fund defense and intelligence.
Yeah, for those of you listening, the 600 of you who are tuning in on my conversation with Charlie, you may not know that Charlie has almost perfect recall. He and Arnold Schwarzenegger share that quality, and listening to Charlie is like listening to a history of our business. And I always enjoy it tremendously. So I'd want to ask you, Charlie, what would be your advice to the new Director of National Intelligence based on your long career? What have you seen has been the most effective leadership in the IC? And what advice would you give to him?
Well, the most effective leadership in the IC has been when there were DCIs, and you and I were there. The DNI has struggled because he doesn't have all the authorities and all the response, and it takes really bulletproof kind of leadership to lead the DNI. But I saw Helms, and the guy I saw and worked with most closely was Bill Casey, and I went with him down to see President Reagan make some big calls at the time. And that's really good. And to work closely with CIA's Director of Science and Technology during the period when we were putting the SR-71 into being and flew it over the Middle East in an emergency way in 1972. I'm sorry, 73. We did some incredible things in those days. The one thing that worries me today is resiliency. I don't think we're very resilient. We're so tactically oriented over the last 10, 15 years. We've forgotten that there's a need to be resilient. We were not resilient with our space systems in the 1970s and 80s, because the program managers, I went to them, I go to Bob Cohen, he said, I don't have money to harden this satellite or that satellite for whatever purpose. And we always punted on this issue. Well, we can't punt anymore. And we've got to have resiliency and capability of the launch on warning on the need to replace satellites that may be taken down. For years, we let the Russians and the Chinese move ahead in space, and we're still catching up.
Yeah, I think for many people, they don't realize that our satellite systems in the early years were strategic reserve systems. We didn't want to risk them, and we held them back. They provided great collection, but they were not at the forefront as they are today. So you're absolutely right, Charlie. I want to talk for just a moment about something because I think it intersects with some things going on in the country today. Your last government assignment was as before the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, was as the Senate confirmed head of intelligence at the Department of Homeland Security. And you, of course, in that role served as the bridge between intelligence and law enforcement and between federal, state, and local governments. We are seeing a movement today, long overdue, to recognize racial inequalities and to demand for racial justice inside the country. How do we square our history of intelligence and our history of homeland security and law enforcement with the need for racial justice? And what can the intelligence community, the broader community, do to deal with this issue positively and effectively in the U.S.? That's a big question, and I'm think about it for a second if you want to, Charlie, but I'd really appreciate your perspective on it.
My perspective is that we've got to go back and think, we did this under you. We recruited in black colleges across the country. You sent Jim Simon out, as I recall. He did a lot of this and did it very well. But it was only a beginning. We did, when we fought the Soviet Union, we had racial problems in this country in '68. I remember it very well. Vietnam in '68. What a difficult time it was. So we have had difficult problems today, but when you look at where we are in 2020, the voices will not be quieted this time without real remarkable change. And the intelligence community, INSA, can help, can lead the way. We've always took this as a huge problem. We work globally. We've got to understand culture and languages globally. Well, there's no reason why we cannot change the face of the intelligence community to make it more diverse and more inclusive than it is today. We didn't do enough of this. I promoted people at Homeland Security. I promoted people based on merit, but they were not all white, thank God. And I learned a lot by working with police. I worked across the country with all the fusion centers and chiefs of police in major cities. Kathy Lanier was one at the time. And I recognized how different it was and what different problems we have and how institutional they were. Being raised in the South, I saw racism, I saw it up close and personal. And I have tried all my life to not permit what I saw, the racism in the South. And the racism was not just in the South, it was across the entire country. And we see it there today. Minneapolis is not where I think we would start the problem, but we've got to deal with it. The DNI, this is one thing he can do under his authorities today, is to push for greater diversity and inclusivity and change. And believe me, there are plenty of people in the clandestine service under Gina that need people who can blend in with other cultures and speak other languages. We've got to take off, pull up our socks, as Bobby Ray Inman always used to say. Pull up your socks. My socks are always up, but to say that anyway. That's Bobby Ray, and he's brilliant. He still teaches at Texas. He is that kind of new beginning is an opportunity for DNI Radcliffe, who doesn't have an intelligence background at all, but he does and can lead in this area along with others in the community.
Yeah, as we used to say, Charlie, it's both a moral imperative and it's a business imperative. And I agree with you. white males have to take this issue on and make progress on it. We've done a great job at expanding diversity with women. We have done a far less good job of expanding diversity with people of color, and there is much, much more that we need to do. I want to give a chance. We have a lot of questions in the queue from our audience, and it's a broad range of questions. I'm not going to try to edit or organize them. So this is going to be a lightning round. If you have questions to ask out there in the audience, please send them in. I'm going to start with Mark Bitterman from Stratolaunch, an interesting company doing interesting work right now. Mark asked, what is your view of the hypersonic threat from Russia and China? And is the United States finally doing what's needed to prepare for that threat?
Well, Russia has publicly stated it has now operational hypersonic capabilities within its military, which is pretty amazing. And they have a couple of regiments deployed. China has been way ahead of us in hypersonics. They've been testing and testing and testing, and thank God we have some capability to understand what they're doing. We've come late to the game, and it's in the fourth quarter, and but we are starting now to develop what we can. Again, that's our lack of foresight, our focus on dealing with Al Qaeda, dealing with ISIS, doing COIN, counterinsurgency, doing counterterrorism, and not thinking of the future and not warning of the future. So hypersonics is an area of great concern to me.
I want to, and I'm not going to put the questions in context, so I'm going to be jumping around a little bit, but this one actually does relate to hypersonics. I have a question from Sean Naylor about how important was human intelligence from agents in Cuba to your analytic work during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think you can extrapolate that to how important is human intelligence collection today, Charlie? What was it like back then? How important is it today?
It was crucial in those days because our intelligence, we finally started flying the U-2 thanks to Macomb over Cuba. And we found them, the SS-4s and the SS-5s. But we had human source reporting in July and August of 1962, which said, you know, all this activity was occurring. I was on distribution for it, all of it. And I felt there was something very serious going on there. And thanks to Macomb, we found it. Excuse me. But we do need human source intelligence today. Gina Haspel has made that as a foundational effort to keep human going, to build traditional capabilities in culture and languages. We had that at one time. We've lost a lot of that in our more tactical orientation of CT. We've got to get deep into our leadership's plans and intentions. And we also need to have a smarter clandestine operator. The clandestine operator of the future has got to know what technology really can do. He's got to know what software. He's got to understand the data rates at which things are now flying across communications. So we need a new approach to operations that we haven't had in the past. In the past, you went to cocktail parties or you had lunch with a potential recruit. That world still exists, but it doesn't exist nearly to the extent it's got to change dramatically. And you've got to be able to do virtual recruitment. You got to handle virtual walk-ins. When I went overseas first time, the COS called me in and said, this is what you do when you get a virtual walk-in. Well, you aren't going to get, you may get a virtual person that wants to work for you, and we have. So the world has changed tremendously.
It has changed, and I think to follow up on that, on your last point there, we have a question, and Joseph, I apologize, I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce your last name, but it's Joseph Bout, I think, who asked about what are some of the efforts the DNI and IC should focus on for strategic warning for issues like the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously is a national security issue for us, on internal political strife, and on the economic crises. areas that in the past were not necessarily a significant focus for the IC? What do we do different in the future?
We have really got to bring back strategic warning, and I'm looking to DNI Radcliffe and Neil Wiley, with whom I've had conversations on warning, and looking at the other issues. It's not like writing, the outlook 25 years from now, which I think the National Intelligence Council does a good job, but it's to look in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, and to lead this effort. It's got to be led. There's got to be a framework. It's now within the National Intelligence Council and the NIOs. My view that it won't work unless we make some reformation. Bob Gates said at a National Foreign Intelligence Board meeting that the regional analysts will be the last to recognize warning. And when you look at it, and you look at what happened in Indo-Pac and the threats there, it's always been the regional analysts who couldn't see the threat coming. So we've got to build a whole new framework. There's got to be a whole new approach. And the BAB, the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, I think is playing a role there and can play an even greater role in the future.
All right, great, Charlie, thank you. And may answer that strategic warning is one of the biggest issues facing the IC, but we've got a question actually from Tish Long. Have to address this one, is what are the biggest issues facing the community today?
Well, the biggest issue is to redirect, and I think getting back to Tish and NGA is doing that. That has been trying to do that. Getting back more to the strategic threats that are overwhelming us, and we're not well prepared, is to be able to get on top of this, to be able to do what Sue Gordon started with her AI ML initiative a couple years ago. Without Sue, we would not have that AI initiative. She was a real leader, and the main thing under one of the things we really need to do under he may not know it, DNI Radcliffe, is to push hard with acquisition reform. Kevin Miners is working hard at that and making progress, but he needs the imprimatur of the DNI working with all the leaders of the community and with the people like Will Roper at DOD, if we're going to get back on top of things. We're very late in the game.
Charlie, I want to circle back. We have a question from Lenora Peters Gant, who is a longtime champion of diversity, both with us at the old CMS, but also in NGA and elsewhere. Lenora wants to know what more the IC and national security organizations can do to attract America's best and brightest diverse talent in this climate of protest against systematic, adverse racist policies and processes. You addressed this a little bit in your earlier comments, but what more can we do to make the community inclusive and to make it be an employer of choice for all Americans?
I think we have to recognize that we have great opportunity as we move into cyber and cyber defense and offense. We have thousands of skilled jobs in industry that are not filled because they cannot find the right recruits. My view is that all the universities, the research universities in particular, should and we should encourage it, because we have CIA and others, NGA, have a relationship with all the research universities. That's a great place, and thank you, Lenore, for the question. That's a great place where we would want to get people from minority groups to be able to graduate those and to find incentives, and to find intern programs or co-op programs as CIA has run. We need that. We need that on steroids. It's not on steroids today.
Good. Let's see, Charlie. Julie Robb from NGA is How did our intelligence failures or challenges affect the way you assessed collection strategies? I got to see this up close and personal, but I'm interested in your perspective on how they affected your collection strategies.
Well, they affected me deeply. The 73 failure just drove me, it stayed with me and haunted me and still haunts me. The 9/11 was a little different because of the breakdown between foreign and domestic and who had responsibility. We did the overseas under George Tenet, we really did. But the failures really affected me a great deal, and we can learn from that. But we talk about lessons learned, just like Bob Gates did this special infib in 1992, laid out a whole program for implementing and building a whole new framework for warning. It went away because he was gone. And our problem with, and the reason I would not look to the NSC to do warning. I guess Matt Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, who's well known, is very focused on China and helping drive China. But I wouldn't look to the NSC. I look to the intelligence community I look to the NSC to give us the intelligence priorities, working with the heads of agencies and departments. But I look to the intelligence community to do that. I agree with you. The President's Intelligence Advisory Board should always be strategic and should always look for ways to bring to the attention of the President and his advisors issues that aren't on the front burner, but issues he should think about. We're very good at front burner issues.
We are. It's maintaining that long-term focus that is always the challenge for us. Interesting question from Ken Lee. Charlie, if you were DNI, what would be your top 3 priorities for change?
My top 3 priorities for change, and first is to say that we're in debit a great deal. We're 10 years behind in dealing with some of the challenges. We've got to find a way to align our budget program with the threat, and we haven't done that. And you can't do it under the way we've done business in the past. It's got to be a whole new approach to it. We've got to. The second thing I would do is, Sue Gordon had a great article in CNBC, which said the COVID crisis has caused us to pull the future forward. I think that's right. She's absolutely right. So we got to do that and adjust to that. We've got to then, thirdly, look at how we can, all of our deficiencies, how we can overcome them. And in the past, DoD has been there when we needed it in a crisis, as you pointed out earlier. That's when we make change. We may not have that crisis now, and the focus may be on domestic issues. But there's got to be strong allegiance between the intelligence community and the big machine, which is called DoD. And without that big machine working with us and working strategically with us, look at Breedlove when he was EUCOM, when he was head of EUCOM. He couldn't get any ISR efforts to cover what was going on in Eastern Europe, and 100,000 troops. Russia moved 100,000 troops, and we missed it. They were all, 2 armies were aligned opposite Ukraine. We didn't even give warning of that. We cannot afford ever to do that again.
Charlie, I was going to ask you for your closing thoughts because we're about at the limit of our time. I think you might have just given them, but what would you tell young intelligence officers today who are looking at this career and looking at the challenges, and based on your experience, tell them how they should be thinking about their role?
First, it has to do with duty and dedication and a driving need to keep the country safe as you can. It will suffer some setbacks, but your job above all is to help keep the country safe and develop the new capabilities and the new ways of looking at the world in the future. We've got to solve the data problem, which is so heavily and we got to solve supply chain. We've got to look at cyber attacks against us. The incredible need for the best and the brightest to take on what I consider to be sort of nirvana, working against the enemies and getting inside his secrets.
Thank you, Charlie. As always, terrific conversation. I hope that our large audience sees you in the same light that I do. You are a national hero. You're one of my favorite people in the whole world. I had a lot of trepidation when George Tenet asked me to bring you in to the new DDCI community management staff, but it was probably the best decision George ever made, and I'm so glad that I went along with it. We had a lot of fun and a lot of challenges, Charlie, but you know I love you and can't thank you enough for your leadership, patriotism, and service to the nation. There will never be another Charlie Allen.
Thank you, Joan. That's much too kind, but thank you.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. For all of you who are watching online, thank you for taking the time. I want to thank Microsoft again for supporting this program. Our INSA industry partners are absolutely essential, and you do so much for the community. So thank you for your continuing support. On the screen, you're going to see a listing of upcoming INSA events. You can also check the website for all the details. This concludes today's program. Stay safe and healthy, and I hope you all have a terrific day. Thank you, Charlie. Love you.
Thank you, Joan. Thanks very much. Good questions.